Hi there, everyone. Bryan here from the Oraculos School of Astrology, and we are diving into yet another day of our blind chart reading marathon. In these blind chart reading marathons, I demonstrate how I would look at the chart on the spot without having any background information about the person who is submitting the charts at all, in order to demonstrate really how my mind thinks in terms of astrologically assessing the natal promise of a person from their natal chart, but also with the intention of demonstrating concrete event based astrology. So I hope that you all are enjoying these blind chart readings. I hope that you're not only learning some things about how to organize yourself in the process of reading a chart, but I also hope that you're learning things in terms of skills that any person who teaches astrology should be able to display. And this is the baseline. Being able to read a chart without any background information whatsoever is the baseline of those skills. And we want to know that the people who we're studying with, the people who we're learning from, the people who place themselves in positions of authority within our astrological community have the ability to read a chart on the spot in whatever way they practice, which might be very different from the way that I practice, but we want to know that every astrologer who we will ever learn from has the ability to do this. Because if someone can only talk astrology, but they can't show their astrology, then that probably isn't someone who is a reliable person to be growing your own astrological skills of astrological demonstration and proficiency with. So the first thing we do is we start by assessing the ascendant. And the reason for this is because the ascendant is going to give us everything we need to know in terms of the physical body as well as the mental, emotional, psychological organization of this person in this lifetime. So the ascendant is 11 degrees, Cancer, 41 minutes. The next thing I would do is I would look for the hidden aspects. They're probably not necessarily aspects, but they're hidden stuff that's occurring to the ascendant, or hidden connections occurring to the ascendant. So as far as hidden aspects are concerned, we start off by looking for the antisha / the contra antisha, which is going to give us something of the concrete realities that are occurring within her early childhood or physical environment. And so 11 degrees Cancer, the antisha degree of that is going to be 19 degrees of Gemini. So I look to see 19 degrees Gemini this way, nothing's going on. 19 degrees of Sagittarius, there's nothing going on, so we say not available. Next is going to be our octiles, and octiles represent eighth harmonic aspects, so aspects divisible by the number 45. So 11 degrees of the cardinal signs equals 26 degrees of the fixed signs. So I look in this chart for 26 degrees of fixed, and we don't see anything at all at 26 degrees fixed. So we move on, once again, not available. And then the final thing is going to be the declination. Aspects by declination are known as parallels or contraparallels. So we look and we see she has her ascendant is having 22 degrees north, 55 minutes declination. And Saturn is 22 degrees north, 23 minutes declination. So she is having Saturn parallel the ascendant. The next thing that we're going to do is look for the obvious things happening within her chart. First obvious thing is going to be planets in the ascendant. And so far we see she has no planets in the ascendant, even though she has that Saturn very close to the ascendant, and that's going to play a very pivotal and I dare say critical role in the larger unfolding of her natal promise. But she has no planets in the ascendant, so that's not available. Next is aspects to the ascendant. We're going to take into consideration Saturn conjunct the ASC, and that's how we would write that. We would also make note of the fact that Saturn is L7 as well as L8 in the conjunction to the ascendant, which is a little bit, there's some stuff going on with that Saturn that we are going to talk about. So we have the Saturn conjunct the ascendant. The next thing is going to be the Pluto square the ascendant, 90 the ascendant from the 4th house. Pluto is in the 4th house, so that's a little bit on the edgier side of things, because in general, we don't like to see Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto in the 4th house, and we also don't like to see them in the 4th house afflicting the ascendant. So she already has Saturn afflicting the ascendant, and she has Pluto afflicting the ascendant. both of which is talking to us about the early childhood environment that she was in, and we're going to further clarify that with language and examples as we go on. Uranus isn't doing anything. The Neptune is at 8 degrees Sagittarius, 7 minutes. The ascendant is 11 degrees, which means the Neptune is in a bit of a quincunx to the ascendant, 8, 9, 10, 11. We can call it a 3 degree and a 3 degree, 3/4 quincunx to the ascendant. I'm going to write it down, Neptune 150, the ascendant. She has Neptune in the 6th house in a quincunx to the ascendant. And we don't really like planets in the 6th house to be having aspects to the ascendant because the 6th house is our house of sickness as well as stress. And so it's not necessarily the best place in the world for anything to be making a challenging configuration to our ascendant from, but we're going to see how that plays out later on. The Mercury is doing a no, the North Node is a no, the Sun is a no because she doesn't have the Sun opposite the ascendant. Rather, we would say she has the Sun conjunct the descendant, and she technically has the Sun in the 6th house. So we're going to leave that Sun alone altogether. She has the Moon not opposite the ascendant, but she has the Moon conjunct the descendant. So we'll write that down. She has Moon conjunct the DESC. Moon is L1, and so that is interesting. 9 degrees with the Venus, 9 degrees to the ascendant. That's closer than the Neptune, so we're definitely going to take it. She has Venus in a 150 to the ascendant, and we want to know which houses that Venus is ruling. The Venus is ruling the 5th house, L5. It's in the 8th house, so there's that. Then she has the Jupiter, which is also in a 150 to the ascendant, with the Jupiter being the 6th house ruler. So there are a few things going on within this chart. Jupiter 150, the ascendant, and Jupiter is L6 as well as L10. There are a few things going on within this chart that are considerable already because we see a lot of connection from the 6th house to her ascendant, which isn't necessarily the easiest sort of configurations in the world. The 6th house is the house of sickness. It's also the house of slavery, and because I don't really care too much to talk about slavery in the 21st century, I call it the 6th house of sickness as well as stress. So you see it, I see it, we all see it. She has the Neptune quincunx the ascendant from the 6th house. She has the Jupiter and the Venus quincunx the ascendant from the 8th house, and those things don't necessarily bode well from a health perspective. Now, I'm going to talk about them and hopefully not embellish them too much, but I plan to read these things exactly as they are and talk about how they would show up within the lifetime of anyone if they had these sorts of configurations. Now, moving on, she has the Chiron in a square to the ascendant. So everything we see that she has squaring the ascendant are things that we wouldn't want to be squaring the ascendant, or we wouldn't want for them to be in hard aspect to the ascendant at all. And so we see those things occurring. The Mars isn't doing anything to the ascendant. It's too far. The South Node is too far. And the part of fortune is too far, but it's conjunct the Saturn. Now, the last thing I want to do is the ruler of the ascendant. The ruler of the ascendant is the Moon at 14 degrees of Capricorn, 25 minutes in the 7th house, which is interesting, and I'll say why it's interesting later. The 7th house is the house of marriage, period. Even though it could be the house of business partners, it's specifically the house of marriage. And we technically don't really like to see when the ruler of the ascendant is in the 7th house of marriage, because it says that I'm completely giving up myself for the other person who I find myself in a relationship with, and that may not necessarily do the most amount of good for a person as far as autonomy in their relationship is concerned. It could create a very real sense of dependency and codependency that isn't necessarily giving her the sort of freedom to experience herself as her own person, because she's so centralized within that 7th house. The next thing that we're going to do is talk about the aspects to the ruler of the ascendant. Aspects to the ruler of the ascendant. We have Moon at 14 degrees of Capricorn. We take that in a counterclockwise direction. That's a nothing, that's a nothing. This Chiron, Moon Chiron, I don't know if I've told you all already about my Moon Chiron ruminations, But very often, the Moon Chiron combination is representing a person who is having a very potent, challenging maternal story. Now, we saw that a couple days ago with someone else who had the Moon in a parallel relationship with Chiron, which she doesn't have in this chart right now. But we did see that a couple days ago, and the Moon Chiron story is showing up more often than not, 9 times out of 10, as someone who's having a potently challenging and very chaotic relationship as far as the mother is concerned. So that's one of the signatures we see here within this chart. We go on from the Moon Chiron. The Mars is a no, South Node is a no, part of fortune is a no, that's a no. Anything else? We have the Moon in a square relationship to Pluto. She has Moon 90 Pluto. There are tighter aspects in this chart, but she definitely has the Moon 90 to the Pluto. She has the Uranus is a no, that's also a no. So we have all of the aspects to the ascendant. Now we are very ready to begin our chart delineation. With everything being said, I also noticed that she's born in the hour of Saturn, and so that's only further adding to the story that's going on within my mind. She has a cardinal water sign ruled by the Moon rising, and when we have a cardinal water sign rising, one of the things it says is that we are willing to go out of our way to accommodate other people, because water has this natural plasticity attached to it that allows it to be willing to shift and change its shape for the purpose of accommodating other people within the life of the native. Now, the negative of this is that the person can be too malleable and too shiftable and too changeable and too willing to change their stance in order to make sure that other people are feeling comfortable. And the positive side of this is that it gives a person a natural understanding of the needs and the emotions of others, which causes those people to feel very held and cared for and supported within the life of the native. So those are some of the things we see in terms of the water by itself. Cardinal water is interesting because water moves, but it doesn't like to move. And actually, let me rephrase that. Water moves, but it doesn't like to be jostled. And cardinal water is often jostled, which is similar to what I said a couple days ago about the cardinal earth as it relates to Saturn and Capricorn. Cardinal water is always jostled, and as a result of that, they try to double down very early in life to figure out, where is my home, where is my family, where is my tribe, where is my collective? Because if you find yourself moving through a world that feels as if it's always jostling you, then one of the things you strive to do is to find out, where is my home, where is my tribe, where is my family, where is my collective, very early on, because that becomes an act of utter survival for you. So when a person has cardinal water on their ascendant, they need to find family. And that's a very interesting thing to say, because one would imagine that someone is already coming into the world with a family. However, that's seldom the case for people who have the Cancer rising, because there's this urge to find family and there's this urge to create family in the world around me and to transform other people into the world around me into my extended family in the world. So here we don't have just a story of a family of birth, we have a story of a family that I create, and possibly that's because of some of the challenges that might exist within this native's life as far as her actual family of blood is concerned. So the familial bond becomes very important, and because this person could be so wary about how other people interact with her life in general, she could also be someone who's holding herself at bay, or who's holding herself away from really launching into deep connections with people very early on. So she might seem very standoffish at first, or she might feel very cool and very reserved until she knows that those people who have now entered her life are safe to be there, and then she can open up and hold them with all of the maternal affection that she gives to anybody else. Maternal affection is going to be a very important topic that we talk about in this chart, because especially with the Moon in Capricorn and the Moon, and not necessarily the Moon in Capricorn, the Moon in the domicile of Saturn, and the Moon also in a square relationship to Chiron, the maternal affection side of this story could be something that's lacking within the life of this native in general. Now, the next thing that we could say is that she is moon ruled. And being moon ruled causes a person to move within the world from the day they're born, feeling everything. And feeling everything manifests for different people in different ways. That feeling everything could make this person be very emotionally sensitive. That could make her be someone who's very perceptive to the thoughts and emotions of others, even if those thoughts and emotions of others aren't really expressed. And that feeling everything could also lead this person to not necessarily having the greatest barometer as far as her moods are concerned. So this is the sort of thing where someone could be extremely pleasant and happy in 1 second, but also extremely the opposite of that in another moment. And that could be something that is showing up within her interpersonal relationships. And that can also just be something that she's knowing about herself in general. And one of the tricky things with that is that when a lunar person is going through their multiple phases in life, other people around them may not know where they stand because they're not sure whether that lunar person is having a good day or a bad day, or a bad day that can become a good day, or a good day that can become a bad day. It could be a very stressful thing in general for others within the life of the native to have to navigate. Now, she is having the moon at 14 degrees Capricorn, 25 minutes in the 7th house. This is one of the indications that is saying that she is able to nurture others, be a caretaker of others, put her own needs aside, defer her own gratification to a later date in order to support the people in her life, particularly as far as the spouse is concerned. This is something that is showing up very strongly within her chart. One of the challenges with this, however, is that when we defer our own needs to support our spouse indefinitely, it can create a sense of us going out of our ways in ways that are uncomfortable in order to make other people comfortable. Having the rule of the 1st house in the 7th house is kind of a curiosity in astrology because it indicates that I have gone to the opposite side of the chart to find the thing that I'm going to constellate my life around. It represents that I have gone as far away from my own home as possible. We know that the home of the moon in this chart would be the 1st house. And this can be an indication that she's gone as far away from her home as possible in order to accommodate and in order to support the needs and the lifestyle and the desires and the intentions of her marital partners. And so this could be something that she's finding manifesting more often than not within the context of her one-on-one intimate relationships. Now, the moon in Capricorn, and more so the moon in the domicile of Saturn, it's a very tricky thing in natal astrology in general, because when we have the moon in the domicile of Saturn, it can say that we feel as if we've come into this world and as if we were born on the top of a cold and barren mountain, and as if we didn't actually have a family to rely on, or we didn't actually have people in our immediate environment who had our best interest at heart. So it could very well feel for the native as if she's had to grow herself up, she's had to suckle herself on her own breast milk, which might be a very graphic image, but it gives a sense of how people who have this configuration might feel in life in general, and it might feel as if she's had to be the be-all and the end-all in terms of how she is supported within this lifetime. These could have posed very real challenges for her within her life. However, they could make her be that much more strong when it comes to realizing the way how other people need to be taken care of. So here we have a cause and effect situation. As a result of her possibly not feeling very well taken care of within the context of her lifetime, in the context of her family contacts and her family relations, she may now turn around within her older life and want and desire to stand in places of care for other people. And so this is something that we sometimes see within the charts of therapists, which I think is a very interesting thing. And I think it's interesting because what that has kind of said to me over the years is that very often people who are therapists become therapists as a form of self-healing as well. And it looks as if, or it oftentimes looks as if, they become therapists because they want to assist other people in navigating some of the treacherous and tragic waters of life, because they too have been through those treacherous and tragic waters of life. And there's nothing quite as healing as hearing somebody else's story and knowing that somebody else's story could be potentially more challenging than yours, and knowing that even though you have had a challenging story in life to begin with, there are other people who have had it worse. And so very often people who are doing therapeutic work, whether that is one-on-one talk therapy, whether that is dream work or counseling or psychiatry or psychology, very often those people are people who have a lot of family trauma themselves, and as a result of that find themselves gravitating towards the healing arts as a means of, I don't even know why, I think it might be as a means of figuring out their own stuff, but also there's something about the experience of pain, and there's something about sitting with somebody else's experience of pain that allows the parameters of your experience to broaden in such a way where you don't feel hurt by your pain anymore. She also has the moon in a square relationship with Chiron, and the moon square Chiron is further a corroboration that says to us that the maternal story within the life of this native was probably the more challenging story that she had. Very often when people have the moon square Chiron, moon opposite Chiron, moon parallel Chiron, moon contra-parallel Chiron, moon anticha Chiron, moon contra-anticha Chiron, moon semi-square Chiron, moon quincunx Chiron, moon opposite Chiron, moon everything Chiron. As far as it's a hard aspect, as far as moon Chiron is concerned, the story within the life of the native is more often than not a story of my mother did not love me. And once again, I think that this is a very potent thing that we see in terms of the moon Chiron combination in general. And even if it isn't necessarily my mother did not love me, it becomes a matter of there is a very real toxic thread within my life, and I identify that thread as coming through the matriarchal line of my family. Because it could be that I felt as if I didn't have maternal support. I felt as if I didn't really have maternal love. I felt as if I had to fend for my own. I felt as if nobody was really there to support me. I felt as if the maternal piece of things that I would have wanted was absent, and that absent could be absent for a number of reasons. It could be absent because mom was busy working. One of the things that we find within the writings of Dorotheus of Sidon is that when a person has the moon in any of the two domiciles of Saturn, but particularly when a person has the moon in Capricorn, it can indicate that their mother was a slave. Now, what does that mean, and how do we contextualize something that was written over 2,000 years ago in the 21st century? One of the things that can indicate is that the mother of this person is having a very challenging time in general, and as a result of the mother having a very challenging time in general, it created a very challenging time for other people within the family unit. And even if the mother tried to show up as strongly as she could show up, she still, being so barred by the realities of her larger life experiences, she still felt as if that was possibly impossible for her to do in a way that was genuinely good, or in a way that genuinely could improve the quality of life of the native. At the most positive, this indicates that this person's mother is very hardworking and overworking, and probably someone who's having multiple jobs, and as a result of that can't really show up within the maternal role because she's really showing up in a survival role. And at the most negative, this could be a person who is having a very challenging relationship with a mother who is, for all intents and purposes, absent as far as the role of motherhood is concerned specifically. Now, we're moving on from the moon Chiron, but we do know that she has Chiron in the 10th house, and very often Chiron in the 10th house could be an indication that the person is working within the healing arts, or the person is working within a therapeutic capacity or a therapeutic modality as a counselor, as a talk therapist, as some form of therapist when we have the moon in the 7th and Chiron in the 10th. It could also represent someone working in medicine specifically. And this is something I wanted to say the other day, because we had a chart that came up the other day, and that person had Chiron node in an anticha relationship with each other on the 90-degree dial. And my commentary regarding that was that when a person has Chiron node, they're oftentimes working with the sick. However, when a person has Chiron node they're also oftentimes the ones who are sick. And that's something that we saw within the chart of that lady the other day who said that she hadn't been employed for 20 years as a result of her being sick. So one of the things I wanted to share was that very often the combination that we find for the chart of the doctor is also the combination that we find in the chart of the sick. Very often the combination that we find within the chart of the police officer is the same combination that we find within the chart of the criminal. So that's something that's worthwhile to know in general. So we do see her having Chiron in the 10th house, which is more often than not one of the indicators of a person who's working in the medical profession or who's working in one of the adjunct medical professional fields. However, at the same time, Chiron is the most elevated planet within her chart, so we wonder whether or not that's having direct implications on her health specifically. I think that there are other things here that are having implications on her health specifically, and I would like to think that that Chiron in the 10th has more to do with her working as a therapist for other people. But maybe that's wishful thinking. So that's the Chiron. Now we move on to other aspects. She doesn't have Saturn in an oppositional relationship with her moon, but she does have Saturn conjunct the first house cusp. Having Saturn in this chart conjunct the first house cusp tells us that the first major experience of loss that she had within her life would have been around the age of 11 years old. And that loss that she would have experienced around the age of 11 years old really set up the pattern of a theme within her life. And that theme could be that within my home environment, I don't necessarily feel as if I have all of the things around me in order to really feel taken care of or in order to really feel nurtured. So there could be a theme of a lack of nurturing there. It could also be a theme of the home environment manifesting itself in a way that was very strict and very stern, and that required her to also be very strict and very stern in her outlook on life in general. And so that could have impacted how she grew up. That could have impacted the sort of responsibility that she took into herself. That could have impacted her navigation of the world around her in general. Because when we have Saturn this close to the ascendant, it very much indicates that we were raised and there was a rule book that was a very specific rule book that demarcated how we should experience joy, how we should experience pleasure, how we should experience pain, when we should cry, when we shouldn't cry. And that could have been a very strict set of circumstances for her to live in, which probably ended up creating a very strict set of circumstances for her herself as a person later on in life. So truly understanding how to express herself in a way that is free of the influence of any of those rules from her childhood might be something that she finds herself having to deal with now. And as a result of that, that aspect of self-expression might be very much challenged within her birth chart. She might be a person who says, I don't know how to cry. She might be a person who says, I can't tell the last time I've cried. And possibly it's because crying for her really represents the least pragmatic thing that one can do in terms of organizing themselves within the world. And so that causes her to once again be a person who we trust to be at the steering wheel, because she knows how to organize the world around her, and she also knows how to organize other people within that world, because she has had to grow up within a container where she had to figure it out very early on. So that's one of the things we see with the Saturn being there so close to the ascendant. I keep on using this rather vague and nebulous statement that Saturn is close to her ascendant. She has Saturn within 11 degrees of her ascendant. There is this concept within astrology, or this idea within astrology, that comes to us from the Gauquelins. And the Gauquelins were a French couple, Mychal and Françoise Gauquelin, who found that very often when a planet is within the 12th house, but within 15 degrees of the ascendant, that planet is able to exert its influence upon the ascendant. So while she is definitely having a 12th house Saturn. That Saturn is within 15 degrees of the ascendant, and as a result of that, we can say that that Saturn is within the 15 degrees of quote-unquote dignity that would allow for it to be considered to be a rising planet. And there is no doubt that when she was born, looking upon the eastern horizon, that is where we saw Saturn. Moving on from this, she has that Saturn ruling the 7th house, and the Saturn also rules the 8th house, and the Saturn also rules the 9th house. Saturn ruling the 9th house says to us that religion could have been a very challenging topic for her growing up, and it could be because religion was probably something that was used in a very malefic and a very manipulative and probably a very dogmatic way within her childhood, to the point where she realized all of the cracks within religiosity very early on within her life, which probably caused her to not to want to be a religious person at all because of issues or challenges she may have had with religion. When we have the rule of our 9th house and the 12th house, that is something that can happen because someone within a religious position of authority took advantage of us when we were younger, and as a result of that, it being in the 12th house could indicate that that is just something that I don't want to touch with a 10-foot pole. I don't want to go to the bishop. I don't want to go to the pastor. I don't want to see the prophet, because I realize that all of those people are just humans, and not only are they humans, but they're very flawed humans at that. So that's one of the things we see by having the rule of the 9th house in the 12th house. Another thing that we see here is that that ruler of the 9th house is also ruling her 8th house, which has to do with the money of her partner. Now, she's in the 7th house of the partner, which can indicate, like I said, a sense of codependency within a relationship that may not necessarily be the best thing in the world, and that could possibly be one of the major challenges that she's facing in terms of her intimate connections with others. She's giving herself over completely to the other, but the other is just hanging out within her 12th house. And so it could be indicating that this is a chart in which there are many potential relationship challenges occurring, possibly because of the financial lack of the partner, or possibly because the partner does not use their money in a way that actually makes sense. And so her partner's use of money could be a very real source of suffering or stress within her lifetime. And since we have the rule of the 8th house also as the rule of the 7th house, we can say that her partner in general and her partner's money are sources of stress and suffering for her within her lifetime. Now, let's go back a couple days ago where I got the lowest grade possible in terms of these blind chart readings, and we had a very similar thing going on within that other lady's chart, because she had the ruler of the 7th house as also being the ruler of the 10th house, and it was in the 12th house in opposition to Chiron. So I interpreted that to represent that that partner was a 12th house figure. And the reality of that is because more often than not, within the context of astrology, when we have anyone within our 12th house, then that person is someone who is showing up in a problematic way within our lives. And so, astrology is not an exact science. It's definitely not a perfect science. And whenever I have experiences like that, I always want to sit down and talk with those people afterwards, because I want to know their story. Because the question for me becomes, after reading thousands of charts within my lifetime, how is it this chart can be so off topic? So whenever I have a chart where something just doesn't land for a person, I really want to sit down and have a conversation with that person afterwards to find out what their genuine understanding of their story is. So if any of you are here and I've done a reading for you, please know that I do want to reach out to you afterwards and sit down and talk with you more in depth, because me sitting down and reading your chart is one thing, but us coming together privately afterwards and you sharing your story is another thing entirely. And it is very important from the perspective of astrological research. Even though the chart the other day was a chart that said one story in relationship to that lady and her partner, that doesn't change the fact that I've seen thousands of charts that have the partner in the 12th house that is read in a very specific way. We can further augment this by saying that this lady has Saturn in the sign of its detriment, retrograde, and in a conjunction with the South Node in the 12th house. All of these things are saying that this person, this partner, her relationship to love, marriage, romance could be a very complicated topic within her life in general, and that her partner specifically is possibly showing up as a very potent source of stress within her life in general. Now, I keep on referencing the chart the other day because we learn best from our mistakes. In this chart, we see something else occurring that is something that very often occurs within the charts of people who are having chronic health conditions that are difficult to ascertain. And what that is that she has the nodes in the 6th and the 12th house. Now, I'm not saying this for people to run buck wild and use this as a means of diagnosing anything in anybody's chart, but having the nodes in the 6th and the 12th house is one of the things that we see often within charts where people are having hereditary health complications that continue to manifest within their lives as chronic illnesses later on. Another thing that she has that stands in support of this is that she has the Sun in an oppositional relationship with Saturn, once again in the 6th and the 12th houses. This is yet another thing that we oftentimes find coming up within people who have hereditary health challenges, because the Sun is representing our baseline vitality within this lifetime, and Saturn is representing our heredity, our lineage, particularly the lineage of our fathers. And so this could be representing another thing that says that there can be hereditary health challenges that are possibly coming to her from the lineage of her father. And these could possibly also be chronic hereditary health challenges as a result of it being Sun in opposition with Saturn, both of them in the 6th and the 12th houses, and having the nodes in both the 6th and the 12th houses. Now, moving on, these things, once again, they can fortify a person because it allows us to know that her story in this lifetime hasn't necessarily been the easiest one, and it hasn't necessarily been the easiest one from the perspective of the family lineage. It hasn't been the easiest one from the perspective of the maternal lineage, and here we see it showing up as not having been the easiest one from the perspective of the inheritances that she got from her family in terms of physical health and well-being. So all of these things are manifesting in a way that's potentially a bit challenging. So the next thing that we see within this chart is that she is having the moon in a square relationship with Pluto. We don't want to see Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto within the 4th house in general. And the reason for this is because all of those planets collectively are malefic planets, and they do harm wherever we find them. And so she has Pluto in the 4th house, and she has the moon in a square relationship with that Pluto in her 4th house. And that can be an indication that the home environment was and could have manifested as a very potent source of suffering within her life. Now, I've seen charts where people have had Pluto in the 4th house and their father died from gang-related violence. I've also seen charts where people have had Pluto in the 4th house and they came from a very abusive background or a very abusive household and home. I've seen people with Pluto in the 4th house and their household and home story could have forced them into a position that they should not have been forced into as children. So people have Pluto in the 4th house for a number of reasons, but in all instances, it seems as if the Pluto is in the 4th house as a means of forcing a person to initiate themselves into something that they probably would have been better off not experiencing at all. Which is why at the Oraculos School of Astrology, we do not call Pluto a planet of transformation, because I feel as if that's a very lackluster thing to say. We call Pluto a planet of forced initiations. And we say forced initiations because very often when a person has Pluto in the 4th house, they are being forced to change some fundamental part of their lives that makes them very comfortable, and the world they live after that change is never going to be the same. And this is something we find manifesting within her early childhood and home. This is also something we find manifesting within her life when she was roughly around the age of 20 years old, because the IC at 16 degrees Virgo is 14 degrees away from 0 degrees of Libra, and 14 plus 6 equals 20. So around the age of 20 years old could have been an age where she would have experienced a major trauma within her life surrounding this Pluto that could have changed the very landscape of her life forever. So that's one of the things we see in this chart in relationship to the Pluto. That could have been when somebody very close to her died. That could have been when somebody within her family died. Or that could have been when some part of her family story completely changed entirely forever in ways that were irrevocable and in ways that she could not reclaim as a result of how deeply everything was changed after that. So the ages in this chart that seem to be very complicated for her are 11 years old, and the next age that's seeming to be complicated for her is 20 years old as well. From a medical astrology perspective, the moon is representing several parts of the body, but more often than not, particularly within the charts of women, the moon is representing the stomach. The moon is representing the stomach for everyone, basically. But particularly within the charts of women, the moon is representing the stomach, and the moon is also representing the womb. And, I feel like I've been saying the same thing for the last couple of days, which at this point may seem very underwhelming. However, we do see the moon in the square relationship with Pluto. From a stomach perspective, when people have moon-Pluto stories, that can manifest within that person having lower abdominal obstruction that causes a great amount of suffering within their lives. Now, we don't see her also having any moon-Neptune contacts, because moon-Neptune often gives us a story of somebody having a weak gut. Moon-Neptune can also give us a story of somebody having a leaky gut. Now, we know that leaky gut, or the concept of having a leaky gut, seems to be pseudoscientific because there is actually no medical diagnosis that you will ever receive from a doctor that says you have a leaky gut. However, if she had the moon Neptune here, that could have leaned us more in the direction of the gut as being a potential source of her medical stories within this lifetime. And just to check, I'm going to pull her chart up on Nova Chart Wheel so that we can see what's going on over here with this moon. So if we put the pointer on the moon, if I drop it on the 90-degree dial with the moon, what she has is the moon is occupying her Mars node midpoint. When we have something occupying our Mars node midpoint, that can very often be an indication of the sort of career we're doing within this lifetime. And so this can be an indication to us that the career that she's doing within this lifetime is a career that specifically has to do with lunar themes. And that can be caretaking, that can be healing. One of the things that the moon also does, which I think tends to get short shrift in astrology, is that could also be someone working with food. Because very often food is also a very lunar thing, because once again the moon represents the stomach and food goes in the stomach. And so a person who's working as a chef could also have the moon as a very prominent figure within their nativity. So that's another thing that we could find within her chart from a lunar perspective. As I pull up the trans-Neptunian points within this chart, just for a bit, because I always am curious to see what trans-Neptunian points a person has coming up within their lives. When I pulled in her midheaven moon midpoint to see what that was falling on, we have it falling on Saturn. So we have the big dot falling on Saturn. So once again, that could be an indication that my mother, because that's what midheaven and moon means, my mother brings Saturn and Neptune into my life. However, remember, I was looking for a moon-Neptune story, and here we see the moon-Neptune story manifesting through her moon midheaven, having the Neptune, having the Saturn. So the point of all of this is that these things collectively could be pointing towards the gut, and they could be pointing towards digestion, just because moon Neptune, like I said the other day, oftentimes manifests when a person is having very severe food allergies or a very interesting relationship with food where they don't really feel as if they're able to eat as freely as they like, or they don't feel as if they're really able to get the sort of nutrients or nutrition from their food as they would like to. And Moon Neptune is a combination for diarrhea. However, Moon Saturn is a combination for constipation. So it's very interesting that she has the Moon midheaven and the Neptune and the Saturn all coming within the same combination, because collectively it's just saying that the digestive story could be a very interesting and potentially a very challenging story for her in general. So if she were to come to me for a medical astrology assessment in which she said, hey, Mychal, what parts of my constitution do you think I should be watching out for, or do you think I should pay more attention to in this lifetime? I would speak to her about gut health, and that being something that she pays more attention to. Now, moving on from the Moon story, the Moon Pluto, once again, is another thing that we find with people who have very peculiar gut health stories. And granted, she has the Moon pretty far away in terms of its separation from the Pluto, so it seems a little bit reckless to even be speaking about the Moon Pluto as being a very strong factor within her chart. However, she does have the Moon angular and she has the Pluto angular. So if we were going to once again put our reputation on the line, we would say that Moon Pluto has to do very often with people who have strange bacterial overgrowths within their stomach. And very often this is a combination, especially if this were a tighter combination, we would think that this were having to do with something like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO, because this is something that we find coming up within that. So there could be a sense of there being growths or there being things within the abdomen that are causing digestion to be a more complicated thing within the life of the native. And that could also be something that's compromising her ability to absorb the sort of nutrients she needs. And that could also be something that's demarcating her life in a very real way. We've really gone into the lunar story quite a bit, but as we see, the lunar story is very deeply embedded in everything else we have going on within this chart. Now, she has the Sun ruling her second house of money, and the Sun ruling the second house of money is in her sixth house of stress. On a very basic astrology level, having the Sun ruling my house of money in my sixth house of stress could say to us that money is a very real source of stress within the lifetime of the native. When you have the rule of the second house in a house, that could represent what your experience of money is like within this lifetime. Now, having the Sun ruling the second house in the sixth house can also indicate for us a source of where she is finding money in this lifetime. So we could look at that and we could say that probably a place where she's finding money is through doing very deep slave labor. And interestingly, this is one of the other things that we find within the charts of people working within the medical field, because medicine could be considered a very real type of slave labor in a sense. It's a labor of love, but it's a very taxing labor all the same. So that could be indicative once again that this is someone who is either making her monies within that industry or making her monies within an industry that is adjunct to that industry. Now, what is more curious within this chart is that she has the Sun ruling the second house of money in opposition to Saturn, which is ruling her seventh house and her eighth house. So one of the stories we see being told here is a story of debt that may be manifesting within this lady's life. And since we have the ruler of the second house of money in the sixth house of sickness in opposition with the Saturn ruling the eighth house of debt, that could be an indication that a lot of where her money is going to within this lifetime is in nurturing and caring for her physical body because of things going on with her health and vitality. So that's one side of that. On the other side of that, we can also use that Sun in opposition with Saturn and say that the ruler of my money is in opposition with the ruler of my partner's money. And so that could show once again that there is an oppositional relationship between the money that is mine and the money that belongs to this other person within my life. Now, once again, that isn't an embellishment. That is just looking at the planet within her chart and saying a very simple basic statement based on that. We see the ruler of the second house in opposition to the ruler of her eighth house. And as a result of that, we can say that there is the monetary side of things that is becoming a very real challenge in terms of how she and her partner are navigating life. Now, she has her money in a conjunction with the north node, whereas her partner's money is in a conjunction with the south node. So, comparatively, we might say that her money is looking as if it's in a better state than the partner's money, which would make sense based on the fact that we said that she could be someone who finds herself having to take care of her partners as a very real part of her lived experience in general. We do have the moon square the Pluto, and we have the partner square the Pluto. So even though she doesn't have the moon in opposition with the Saturn truly, both of those planets are in a square relationship with Pluto. And that's interesting from a love perspective because it can say that these are probably two people who are bonded to each other by trauma. That happens sometimes in life when two people share a similar story, and as a result of their similar story, they find themselves gravitating towards each other, and that becomes the bond between them. So there could be a very real trauma bond here. That could be a very real and very overwhelming bond between the two of them. I think the larger question is whether or not that gives either of them the sort of freedom or the sort of independence or the sort of autonomy to live their lives as individual beings who are individualized and in radiant expression. So that could be one of the things that we find as a bit of a problem, but we do find money between them also being a very real source of the challenges to which they're bound. Now, moving on, we have that Sun also ruling her third house of siblings, and the third house of siblings is having the ruler of that house in opposition to the Saturn. So that could be an indication that my siblings aren't getting along with my partner, my marital partner, and that could also be a very real source of contention within the life of the native. However, we have that Sun in opposition with the Saturn ruling the sixth house of the siblings. So this could be an indication that as she looks back at her siblings and at the story of her siblings growing up, she sees her siblings also being in a state of unwellness. And that could mean that there was a sibling that was chronically sick within the family, that there was a sibling that chronically needed taking care of, and that the siblings represent a very real source of worry within the life of this lady. Moving on to the fourth house of the father and the family, we find the ruler of the fourth house of the father and the family being the Mercury at 25 degrees of Sagittarius, 18 minutes in the sixth house of stress. So once again, on a very real, basic level, this could indicate that the father and the family story in general could have been a very real source of stress for the native within her lifetime. We see the father in his own third house of siblings and short journeys. So this could represent that the father was a trucker, which means that he probably was someone who was driving long distances on a daily basis. He could have been a taximan. He could have been someone who was constantly on the go as far as his work and his job was concerned. He could have been a door-to-door salesman. However, this shows the father as being someone who is constantly on the move. And very oftentimes we see this within the charts of people whose fathers are driving to and fro as a very big part of their work. And not just that dad has to drive to work in the morning, but that dad has to drive within the community because that driving or that mobility is a fundamental part of the work that he is doing. So that's one of the things that we're seeing with this Mercury at 25 degrees of Sagittarius, 18 minutes in the sixth house. But it can also say that dad is a very real source of stress, or that dad is a very real source of worry within the life of the native because the father is here within the sixth house. Now, if we move on to talk about the mother, we find the mother is in the eighth house of the native, and she does have the Venus in a conjunction with the Jupiter there. Now, Venus-Jupiter could be more descriptive of this native's own personality than it could be descriptive of her mother per se. But Venus in a conjunction with the Jupiter, let's take a look and see which houses this Venus is ruling. Venus is ruling the fifth house, Jupiter is ruling the sixth house, and it's also ruling the 10th house. Let's just talk about the mother situation. We have the mother here in her own 11th house, which is the native's 8th house. So that is a very interesting combination. And truthfully, as I look at it, I don't really have that much to say about it, because when we have Jupiter or Venus in the 8th house, that oftentimes is a very good thing. It oftentimes is a wonderful thing to have Jupiter and Venus in the 8th house, because it represents us being able to access inheritances from our ancestors, basically. So that could mean that this native is left in someone's will, or this native has been left a legacy by someone, or this native has been left a great amount of money by someone, which is interesting given the larger story of the life that we've said about her, that should be the case at all. So that one is throwing me for a tailspin, because I don't necessarily see how someone could have the sort of life story that we've delineated thus far on the one hand, and then have Jupiter and Venus in the 8th house on the other hand. Or probably that is the case. Probably it is the case that the family story is a complicated story, but yet still she finds herself being supported by the wealth of her ancestors in some way. So there could be a bit of a silver lining in that context. Now, the next thing that we see is that this Jupiter is ruling the 10th house, which is representing this person's mother, and this person's mother is in the quincunx to the ascendant. And I think that that gives us more of the same in terms of speaking about some of the challenging circumstances that could have been manifesting within the life of the native as far as the maternal side of things, or as far as the maternal story is concerned. Because whenever we have the ruler of a house in quincunx to our ascendant, that becomes a part of our lives that could be very challenging for us to organize or really figure out. We see that the ruler of her 10th house is also the ruler of the 6th house, and so we can say that the mother, as well as the things that stress this person out, are both unified, and they're both having a challenging impact on her physical body, insofar as the ascendant represents the physical body. Now, we have the Venus ruling the 5th house of children, applying to the Jupiter ruling the 6th house of sickness of the native, and they're both in the 8th house. And she has Uranus at 27 degrees Libra in the 5th house of children. So for me, within my astrological awareness, independent of me wanting to, say anything that was politically correct, I would see that as being, I have the ruler of my children, which is oftentimes representing the ruler of someone's womb. Wherever we have the ruler of the 5th house, particularly within the chart of a woman, that can very often represent the womb, because the 5th house is representing conception, pregnancy, babies, children, all of the things. So that's what's going on in my mind. Applying to the Jupiter, which is technically a functional malefic. Within traditional astrology, we have this concept of planets that are benefic and malefics generally, but we also have this idea of planets that are functional malefics. And a functional malefic is any planet that rules the 6th house, the 8th house, or the 12th house. So I see this Venus applying to the Jupiter. On the one hand, that could represent someone who's being fruitful and multiplying, but on the other hand, because this Jupiter is ruling the 6th house, and because the 6th house is a house of our sickness, or things that stress us out, or things that aren't necessarily working out the best within us from the perspective of our health and vitality, that could represent a very complex health story as far as fertility is concerned. And the reason why I say that is because the rule of the 5th house is applying to the conjunction of the ruler of sickness in the 8th house, which is a house of surgery. It's also a house of fear. It's also a house of anxiety. It's also a house of death. So all of those things is making us feel as if that is a very complicated maternal story within her life. And so we could say that the story of maternity that she probably inherited from her mother is probably something that's continuing to manifest within her life as far as her own desire or ability to be a mother. And that could be a very complicated part of her health story in general. Now, moving on, we spoke about the partner, we spoke about the father, we spoke about the mother, we spoke about the money, we spoke about also the siblings of this native. We see the parts of sickness at 12 degrees of Virgo, and it's technically in a quincunx relationship with the Jupiter as well as the ruler of the fifth house. I have some thoughts about it. We also see it picking up the square relationship with the Neptune. I wanted to pull up the midpoint listing. Let's just go and check out the Venus story for a second. Here, I pulled up the Venus Zeus, which is one of our Uranian astrology, medical astrology midpoints. Venus Zeus means pregnancy and procreative ability. And on her Venus Zeus midpoint, what we find is Hades, which sounds exactly like it sounds, or it is exactly like it sounds, and we have Saturn there as well. So having Hades and Saturn falling on the Venus Zeus midpoint is once again bringing up the story. We have the Neptune close, but not close enough, but it's once again bringing up the story of a very complex fertility life within this lifetime. And once again, she's born in 1973, so this could have been something that might have happened to her very early on in life that she has since gotten over, because usually we experience everything within our natal chart by the time as we are 30 years old, and then we go through another cycle of experiencing that again. So probably within the earlier portion of her life, that could have been more of a challenge, having the Hades there. There's another thing that Venus Zeus equaling Hades can say, and it can have to do with, Hades has to do with everything of the underworld. Hades is like a Pluto times 1,000. And so if we have the midpoint that has to do with pregnancy, potentially, having Hades involved with it, it could represent that story within our lives could be a potential area that is feeling like a story that we don't want to keep on telling, because possibly there is something attached to that story of pregnancy, or how we got pregnant, or what happened when we got pregnant the first time, or something within that sphere of things that doesn't feel like the most comfortable thing in the world to talk about or to even disclose. So that's one of the things we see bringing that up here. Now, we're just going to look for the Venus stories by itself just to see. So she has the Venus by itself falling on the Neptune ascendant midpoint, and also falling on the Sun midheaven midpoint. So once again, this is the complications with the man folk within her life, which we weren't sure about before because we didn't know anything about the gender of any partner before. But when we have the Sun midheaven, that specifically has to do with my man. So my man, this is how we would interpret this. We would say my comes from the midheaven, man comes from the Sun. My man within my environment comes from the ascendant, creates a sense of Neptune within my life. Now that could be that my man within my environment are sick. That could be my man within my environment are needy. That could be my man within my environment are a little bit disappointing. That could be my man within my environment are many things. But what this says to us is that the man within the environment lead us to Neptune, and that becomes a part of the love story. Once again, that could be the love story very early on within her life, but it is still showing up as a part of the love story all the same. If we go to the Sun-Moon midpoint specifically, we see it even bringing in more strongly this Venus-Neptune story. The Sun-Moon midpoint within anybody's chart is going to be the combination of marriage within this lifetime, and we have the Venus-Neptune as a part of that. And we also have the Jupiter loosely a part of that. The Jupiter isn't close enough, so I really shouldn't interpret it because she doesn't have the Jupiter close enough to that tiny dot for us to consider it. However, if we did consider it, we would say that she is someone who's getting married to a foreigner, because when we have Jupiter on the Sun-Moon midpoint, that can oftentimes be an indication that we get married to someone who is from far away or from someone who isn't from where we're from. But once again, we have the Sun-Moon midpoint also tying in the Venus-Neptune, and the Venus-Neptune midpoint is our specific midpoint of disappointment in love. And so, once again, that could be a story of, if this isn't someone who has had a divorce already as a result of that disappointment in love story, then chances are it's not going to happen, because we experience our natal promise fully by the time we're 30 years old. But it could represent a very specific pattern that continuously manifests within her life as far as her intimate connections is concerned, and particularly as far as marriage is concerned, because Venus-Neptune in any hard aspect doesn't really bode well for marriage, especially if there are other things that we already see in the chart that further corroborate that. And we definitely have seen quite a bit of things within this chart that do corroborate that. I think that overall, this chart is definitely the chart of a survivor, someone who knows how to survive, someone who has grown a lot of grit through surviving, and that survival comes to us primarily through the experiences that would have happened within the family home. And that survival also comes to us through some of the hereditary things that we inherit from our family insofar as health and well-being are concerned. And that survival also comes through some of the monetary stories that are told within this native's life as far as her monies and her partner's monies are concerned. And that survival can also possibly come from seeing challenging situations unfold within the larger health and vitality of her siblings. So everywhere we go within this chart, we see an additional story or an additional layer of someone who has had to survive within the world. And as a result of that, that gives this person that much more grit, but it also gives this person that much more serenity, which I think is a very important thing that we sometimes overlook, especially when we see challenging charts. We overlook the fact that in order for people to go through life circumstances like the ones that we potentially see being portrayed within this chart, it does create ultimately a level of serenity, and that serenity becomes transferable. Because when you go through one storm after the next, not only do you become more skillful at living life, but you also become more skillful at helping other people know how to live theirs. And so that's where we find this repetition of this theme of this person probably working within the world as a therapist, as a counselor, as someone who can guide other people along the path of healing, because the path of healing is something that she is intimately familiar with. That's all I have to say about this chart. Whosoever's chart this is, you can unmute yourself, please. So on a scale of 1 to 10, and you could be honestly as brutally honest as you like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how does this line up with your lived experience?
Oh my God. This is all I have to say. Oh my gosh. It's quite brutal to say this is oh my God, but this is the story of my life. This is the story of a survivor who brought serenity in her life by all the struggles she has been through. I worked a lot, I fought a lot, but now my life it's quite calm and balanced. But I had to go through a lot of problems and traumas and health issues, and a lot of problem with my parents, with my family, and it is quite amazing how everything you said is so it's so clear in the chat. And yes, I have a lot of notes here, and I quite do not know where to begin from, because it was a very long story. Yes.
Well, what you can do is you can start from the beginning, and start from the beginning, because the more you share, the more we learn. And there were some specific things I said from a health perspective, from a motherhood perspective, from a you being a mother perspective, from a love perspective. So if you could hit on the main points, that would be great.
Yes, motherhood. I do not have children. I had children, but I've lost it. It was a treatment over my pregnancy, and we had to abort the child. And indeed, this is a trauma I am trying to balance even now, because I really do not understand why it happened and why the doctor do not warn us about it. And yeah, it happened. I got pregnant before my marriage. I married at the 28th, a little bit late in life. The child became when I was in the university, and surprisingly, this irradiation came over the pregnancy, and we had to abort it. And since then, I could not get pregnant again. We wanted to have children, especially my husband wanted a lot to have children, but I was not quite sure that I want to go through this experience of motherhood and cope with that kind of trauma I've been through. So no, I don't have children. Yet I love children, and children are feeling so well, so calm, so balanced around me. It's very amusing. They are very amused. I am playing with them. I'm kind like a teacher for them, because when I meet them, they always want me. They want me to tell them stories, and they are such a good listeners, children especially. Um, yeah, this is the story of my motherhood. It's indeed a disappointment for my husband that we do not have children, but somehow he hopes that one day it will happen, even by adoption. Now we are discussing this issue of an adoption, and to be very frank, I'm not quite sure about it, but I see him wanting so much to have a child, and he is a good father, he is a good husband, and this is an experience that I put him through, and sometimes I feel guilty that he has to go through this kind of experience, but this is life after all. Yeah. My mother, we weren't so close to each other. She was a very conservative mother. She worked a lot, and she had to raise 3 children, 3 girls, goat girls. And it was especially difficult because my father was the only one who worked in the family, and my father was a mechanical, and later in life he drove the family car doing taxi. That you said that he was traveling, yes. And yes, indeed, I was the one helping him. But yeah, with my mother, we didn't have. I didn't have a good relationship, but in the in the last 10 years, we are trying to cope and balance our relationship. I try to understand that she did her best to raise us as fine as she possibly could. In the 19th, 18th, it were hard times in Romania. I do not know if you know about Ceausescu and the revolution in '89, and it was a kind of a problem then. And she tried a lot, she worked a lot to raise 3 girls. She lost a baby. Indeed, I was the first baby after the first one, a boy, died. And if I am to link or correlate this information with my birth, it was a very hard labor indeed. And I was told that my father was blaming her for losing the baby at about 1 year, a year old. And I think that shame probably impregnated upon my upon her womb and in my DNA, and I came in this world not sure of wanting to be here. Yeah, yes, this is the relationship with my mother, which is not quite bright indeed, but I'm trying to understand the circumstances and all the labor she did to raise us. Then with my father, indeed was a stressful relationship because I was the first in the family, and he transformed me in the boy of the family, wanting me to help him over the car, over the engine, and all the labors, the hard labors around the house. And yeah, indeed, I learned a lot from his experience, but he was a very strict, conservative kind of person, and he wanted me to be at home at 5 o'clock, and after school, I should have been at home, not 30 minutes away from the program of the school. And this was kind of difficult because I was free when I was with my grandparents a few kilometers, 1,000 kilometers away from my parents, when I had the freedom to do everything I wanted. But yes, indeed, my father was a little bit aggressive, imposing his rules upon the firstborn of us, because the next two sisters to understand the lessons better. I was the escaping goat of his probably frustrations, and I am trying to balance the relationship with my father also, to understand why he was so afraid that something could happen to me, being a girl in that times in Romania. And I'm trying to understand, but not at all, because I do not understand why he had to be a little bit aggressive and imposing when the talk would have made the difference between us. So now the problem of my health, I'm not quite. How should I say? It were times when I was able to eat rocks. Indeed, but sometimes I never had stomach problems, but sometimes a little bit of constipation because of digestive issues, but not chronic illness concerning this part of moon in square relationship with Pluto, where with other aspects, challenging aspects in my heart, in my chart. So I am not working with food, but I am cooking very well for my family. Indeed, I like to do this, and it's kind of a ritual for me when cooking, and I am kind of expressing my emotions there, and I'm putting all the love in it, so to say it. Yeah. Next, yes, it is a condition that concerns the thyroid problems of my mother, and my mother had it cut, surgered, and I do have some problems. I think 2 years ago I discovered a Graves issue at my thyroid, but I think it's a matter of connection with my inner communication and expressing myself to the world. I am not in the medical field, but when I am with people, especially elder people, all are starting to talk to me, or are starting to say stories about their family, about their lives, and they are quite free to talk all kind of secrets around me, and I am quite amazed. I did not ask for it. what happens with it? And
Mm-hmm.
I was working in a maritime authority
Mm.
and was working with divers, a very man-connected job.
Mm-hmm.
I can say to you that I was always trying to adapt myself to the environment, as if I always had a feeling that I did not fit there, because that kind of routine working was not for me. I could not understand it. And then I left from a job to another until all the doors closed, and I um, I became a counselor, and I can express myself through I can understand myself and other people through astrology and through practicing yoga and Tai Chi.
Okay, awesome, awesome. Okay, so the final thing I want to ask, if that's okay, is I spoke about the monetary story just in terms of how that manifests between you and your husband. Can you give us some insight into that if that feels comfortable?
I was I am not in the working field since last year, but my husband is a seafarer. He travels a lot, and he ensures the largest money in the house. And yeah, it was a little of a problem because it were some hardships with some banker credits, and indeed in our first years of marriage we did have problems concerning the money, but now they are a little bit balanced. And yeah, he does not put any tension upon the money. I am the one who is administering, monitoring the entire family income, entire family money. I do not inherited anything until now, but there is still hope.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you so much for being willing to share your story with us, and thank you so much for being willing to be in this space and to have me try to tell your story without really knowing you at all. I'm very humbled to learn from you and to hear from you, and I'm sure everybody feels that way as well.
Thank you so much. And it's another thing I want to point out, that the Hades story is true. And I do not want to say any more any more words, but I wanted to point out that this is correct.
In relation to the pregnancy or the childbirth piece.
In relationship with that trauma.
Got it. Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you all so much for showing up once again to yet another one of these blind chart reading demonstrations. This is something that is very important for me for us to do as astrologers, because I think this is the only way for us to actually show the world what concrete event-based astrology looks like in action. When I was studying astrology with other people, this was always my test for them. Can you read this chart I'm about to give you without me giving you any background information about this person at all? And people who passed that test are people who I went on to studying with for several years, and people who did not pass that test were people who I didn't go on to studying with. And I think I should give that some qualification as well, because some of the greatest astrologers in the world who I know, upon me giving them a chart, they went down a very specific pathway that ended up being the wrong pathway in their delineation of that chart. And so, from my perspective, their interpretation was incorrect. However, those astrologers still were applying a very rigorous and a very clear and a very pristine rubric or approach to what they were doing, to how they were doing what they did. So even in the process of them being incorrect, I still was able to follow their train of thought or their logic. And I think that this is something that we as astrologers have to become okay with. We have to know that our practice is a practice. And every time we practice in this way and demonstrate astrology in this way, we're practicing with the intention of perfecting and mastering a craft and a skill. But astrology isn't an exact science, and at best, it is the equivalent of interpreting an ancient language or trying to interpret hieroglyphics. There are certain languages that don't have vowels, and there are other languages that don't have personal pronouns, and there are languages that are based on context. And I think about astrology in that same way, in that everything we try to make astrology say to us, we're taking it in a larger framework of context, and we're trying to make things make sense within that larger contextual framework. And sometimes we end up landing on gold, and sometimes we end up getting it very, very accurate in terms of the things that we can say. And other times, because we're all human, we end up going down specific pathways that probably, if we had just veered a little bit to the left or to the right, we would have ended up saying something that was more resonant or that was more accurate. The problem with astrology has never been astrology. The problem with astrology has always been the astrologers. Because no matter how great you are as an astrologer, you will never fully understand every way the sky can tell the stories that it tells. And to this end, we keep on practicing. And so even though we know that we might never be perfect because we're not gods, we're not saints, we do not have omniscience, so we may never really get everything correct, we still put ourselves in positions such as these in order to say, I believe in this astrology. I know this astrology works. I know that astrology working looks like astrology being able to describe the very specific events that have occurred within a person's life. And because I know that to be true, I also know that it's okay if I read this chart, because even in the process of me not getting it right, I'll still be within the realm of possibility within this person's life, where when that person tells me their story, I'll see what I could have done differently. So I hope that you all are enjoying these blind chart readings. I hope that you're not only learning some things about how to organize yourself in the process of reading a chart, but I also hope that you're learning things in terms of skills that any person who teaches astrology should be able to display. And this is the baseline. Being able to read a chart without any background information whatsoever is the baseline of those skills. And we want to know that the people who we're studying with, the people who we're learning from, the people who place themselves in positions of authority within our astrological community have the ability to read a chart on the spot in whatever way they practice, which might be very different from the way that I practice, but we want to know that every astrologer who we will ever learn from has the ability to do this. Because if someone can only talk astrology, but they can't show their astrology, then that probably isn't someone who is a reliable person to be growing your own astrological skills of astrological demonstration and proficiency with. So, thank you so much for once again joining us here at the Oraculos School of Astrology. I hope that you are learning a lot. I'm definitely learning a lot. And if you want to continue to learn with us in this way, then by all means, sign up for our upcoming Foundations of Classical Astrology program, which is the first semester of our larger Professional Astrologers Diploma program, which begins this coming September 16th, 2023. I can't wait to see you there. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
So you said that one of the ways that you look at to see when something happened in a person's life is you take the house cusp and you add it to the planet in their house. Did I hear that correctly?
I think I would have said that one of the ways how I see the concrete events that occur within a person's life is I take the house, because the houses represent the concrete topics of life. So I take the house, and then what do? I take the house and I use the ruler of that house to represent that topic within that person's life. And then from there, I get the concrete event. But finding concrete events in a chart is a very nuanced thing to do. So that's only one part of it. But yes, the house cusp is also going to be a very important thing in terms of us figuring out how to figure out the concrete events that occur within a person's life.
So if a person has like Saturn in the first house, in timing what event actually manifested relative to that Saturn, do we look at the degrees between the ascendant and the planet, and does it make a difference about whether or not the sign is fixed, mutable, etc.? How do we do that timing?
Awesome, very great question. So this question has to do with how we look at a chart from the perspective of timing concrete events within the lives of people. The quick and dirty way to do this is to use what are called solar arc directions. And solar arc directions might be the quickest and the dirtiest timing technique that exists within astrology, but we use them because they work. So if a person has, for example, Saturn in their first house at 17 degrees of Capricorn, and their first house cusp is 1 degree of Capricorn, then we know that it will take that first house cusp by solar arc directions 16 years approximately to come to this exact conjunction of that Saturn. And when that happens, we can say to that person that they have a Saturn event, or they have an event in relationship to the houses that Saturn rules within their chart based on the ascendant coming to the degree of their Saturn by solar arc directions. So solar arc directions is what you see me doing whenever I look at a person's chart and I say this thing happened when they were 20 years old, or this other thing happened when they were 11 years old. I'm applying this solar arc to the angles of the chart, especially if we have angular planets within their chart, but I'm also applying the solar arc to planets, especially if those planets are very close to the angles within that person's chart. So in the chart that we just saw, we saw the lady's Saturn at 1 degree of Cancer, and we saw the ascendant at 11 degrees of Cancer. So for me, that was an indication that roughly at around the age of 10 years old, when that Saturn came to the ascendant by solar arc directions, she would have experienced a major Saturnian event. And so that is what we do when we do that, and that's all I have to say about it.